Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Harry Siegel. I'm a columnist and editorial writer for the Daily News. This is Azi Paybarah, who's a senior writer for Capital New York, and is Fred Siegel couldn't be here today. He has a medical issue he's dealing with. So Azi is the new Fred, and we're here to talk a bit about policing in New York City and nationally and what's happening. There's a few interesting things to note. The conversation about policing has changed in some pretty dramatic ways over the last year. In New York City, the Eric Garner case played a big role in that, and then that was followed by the shootings of and murder of officers Ramos and Lou by the police unions stepping off and ceasing to do their job. And obviously all that was preceded by the election of a new mayor who won office in a crowded Democratic primary field in large part by promising to end the overuse of stop and frisk, which was widely taken as promising significant reforms in how policing was going to work in New York City. So we've had an extended run of 20 years in which the crime numbers have gone down, and they might be, Commissioner Bratton now is arguing they are at some bottom, that it can't be a new record low every year, but that we've hit a new status quo. But that hasn't shifted. The narrative instead has shifted somewhat independently of that, which is interesting. To some extent that has to do with over-incarceration and how many people have been in prisons for a long period of time. At a certain point, if policing is successful and there's less crime, and the answer is more policing, this starts to feel wrong or anomalous. And obviously, if there are less violent things going on, more of those violent things tend to involve the police, because they're frequently in settings where some force is necessary, and others where maybe force isn't necessary but is used, and then they're out and interacting with people at all hours of day and night, and not always, the people they would be choosing to. So all that's happened. We have new technologies to make it a lot easier to film things involving officers, and a lot easier to get those films out and in front of a wide audience. From the department's perspective, one of the impacts of those videos is that they say a lot more people are trying to resist arrest. They see cameras there and are demonstrative and performing in such a way as to take charged situations and make them worse. So de Blasio, who again really, won office in large part with promises of police reform, and then brought in Bratton, Rudy's first police commissioner. So that's an interesting dynamic. Rudy, when he talked about policing issues all the time, would say all sorts of right, uncontroversial, and inappropriate things about what a broad city it is, about having respect for all of its citizens, using that really as a shorthand, given the politics of the time, for black people, like good and appropriate comments, and nobody paid any mind. Because it's like, we know what this guy really thinks. You have a sense of who he is, and that didn't seem to match it. Similarly, de Blasio, every time he talks about this stuff, goes on and on. Like, don't resist arrest. If officers do something wrong, we have a civilian complaint review board, we have an inspector general, we have all these court-mandated things. This is not the time to get into it. And this stuff is important not just because of the Garner case here or the other incidents that we've been reading about, or Akai, Gurley, who never mind resisting, opened the door and was shot apparently accidentally by a scared rookie cop for no good reason in that Pink House's stairwell. It's important because that is literally the point. Those interactions and stops and arrests, how many of those you should have, where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, when citizens and some of them, wrongdoers, some of them not, are having these charged interactions with police, and what results from those. Incredibly, the reason we can have this a different conversation about them, about how much reform is needed, if Bratton can do enough and is appropriate to provide that, is again because crime is so low. If those numbers start going significantly up, and this year overall crime is down, but both murder and shootings are up by about 10%, which Bratton has tried, not terribly credibly, to blame on it doesn't match up with the numbers we've seen, to blame on marijuana sales, not use. But if those really start going up, and that conversation shifts dramatically. We got a hint of that after the two officers were shot, and suddenly the protest movement that had been happening here had taken on a lot of steam, and you had these Black Lives Matter protesters who were out, were drawing a fair amount of attention, who with some space from the police in the city were blocking bridges and major roads, not usually in the middle of the day, but doing stuff that can cause complications. And the Post was just waiting for an ambulance to get blocked and someone to die, to say, you see what happens. So we didn't quite get there. Instead, we had these two officers shot, and that conversation almost froze. In the meantime, Bratton, to connect this with what's happening nationally, and the drop in crime in New York was actually very different from the national drop in crime. It was over a much longer period of time. It was much steeper, which suggests that the policing played some significant role, at least here, in why those numbers shifted. Obviously, demography, social changes, all sorts of other things also play a role. And the funny thing is the law enforcement doesn't really know all that much better than the rest of us how much of the drop is policing. And since their job is to police, the argument always, again, with crime up or crime down, is that we need more. We need more to capitalize on these gains, or we need more because things are moving in the wrong direction. Bratton has been in somewhat continuous communication with Comey, the head of the FBI, who's been talking about policing and about race, talking at least in a very different way. You can feel the rhetoric shifting very substantially. When Bratton just met with the Daily News editorial board, he talked about over-policing. He talked about how it's very important that cops don't treat every black kid in the street, his phrase, as a suspect. And that's not the language and rhetoric we've been hearing. And what was fascinating, I wrote about this, was I was getting these responses from the people sort of within the reform world, who think that policing in New York has been bad through these 20 years, and just generally doesn't work, and that it sort of split that off from the related social issues in a way that's guaranteed to be unsuccessful. So I think there's some truth to that. I think there's a fair amount of exaggeration, but within that world, there was this huge divide. I had people emailing me and saying, "How can you buy this? It's new wine in an old bottle, and he can say whatever he wants, but we're not actually seeing that change in how policing is working in New York." And other people who were very excited and said, "Look, this police commissioner who responds to this mayor, Bill de Blasio, who was elected by a very different constituency and on a promise to shift on policing issues." Is accepting this language and putting up signposts that he's going to be judged and assessed by. And that is the path toward significant change. It's the right question, and the answer remains to be seen. And again, I think that we're only going to have any chance of finding out if the crime numbers don't start pushing in the wrong direction. Bratton's argument, in effect, is we had a very sick patient who had symptoms and signs all over, and that patient is now stabilized, and much of the city polices itself. The numbers are much lower in a way that lets us effectively focus policing on people who are actually doing criminal things, as opposed to stopping everyone in areas where there are more guns, for instance, which does end up treating people who maybe haven't done anything wrong or done something trivial and throwing them into the system in what can be really ugly and ways that screw up people's lives. So I want to quickly touch on what happened in Ferguson, and then I'm going to bring Azi in to say a few words, and then we'll talk back and forth and then open things up for questions. So the number that struck me the most, about 2 weeks ago now, I wrote about this, was Rasmussen did a whole set of polling about Ferguson and about policing nationally. And one of the questions was, do you think that the police treat black people fairly? And the racial split there, and there were similar splits on just about every other question, was 82% of black people said the answer to that was no. 82%. I mean, that's 4 out of 5 people. And it's a question about black people. I'm inclined to take their answer seriously. 30% of white people said no, and about 60% said yes. Only about 10% said they weren't sure. And that is a huge split. And the reason why my sympathies are largely with Bratton and with the reformers who think that his shift in rhetoric is significant is that if you want any sort of national change in how policing works, and it's not it doesn't split off from other issues. It doesn't split off from social services, from education, from just generally how it is we're inclined to treat people. And you can push that argument too far, and a lot of reformers do, and arguing that therefore all policing is useless. So there's no point in having that conversation otherwise. Everything is just going to be a matter of injustice. But fundamentally, no one disagrees with this. In the same way, we talk about what to do with poor schools. And New York now has, according to UCLA, the most segregated school system of any big city in the United States, right? And there's this model school is doing well, or maybe this system would do a bit better. But all these reforms, one's from the left, one's from the right, they don't systematize, right? There is no scalable reform. Well, that school's done really well, and we can just expand that to the whole system, because education doesn't split off from all the other parts of these children and their parents' lives. And the same goes with criminal justice. So if we want any sort of broader reform, it's really significant, the large swaths of the society nationally, and even in New York, where it was a different electorate, and de Blasio, just because of the way that primary played out, really owes his election to black New Yorkers who wanted change in a very significant and direct way, and he knows this. Nationally and in New York, to get really broad policing change from these people, these commissioners who aren't elected, who are hired to do this by mayors and by governors and other officials who are elected, you have to have a broad call for it. Obama has paid tremendous lip service to some of these ideas, and Holder has, and Comey has, and yet if you look at what they've actually done, when I've dealt with their departments, like they've talked a lot about how we don't actually know enough about police-involved shootings. There are no national numbers on those. Some states don't submit them at all. They're very hard to compare. So every time one of these incidents comes up, it's like a series of anecdotes about what happened in that particular person. And we have a lot more of these than 5 years ago, or a lot less. We don't actually entirely know, which is crazy. Crazy. So they've talked a lot about this, and I called up Justice, and I was like, okay, so you know, Eric Holder just gave this big speech on this. What are you guys doing? You know, I'd love to see the paper. I want to write something and praise you for starting to get this right. You know, and a week later, after dodging my calls, like, well, we're starting to talk to people about things that maybe we might be able to do to figure this out. And this is after he gave the speech, right? Yeah. If you're serious about that, you have those conversations, you start figuring things out, and then you give the speech. If you want to say, hey, I gave this speech, we're having a discussion, and now we're done, you do it that way. So, in short, in New York, there's some real constituency for policing change, but there are a lot of other people who, you know, feel nervous. It's like a big disruptive city, and crazy stuff happens all the time, whether it's broadly safe or not. You know, it's just what happens to you and to your house, you know, my kids. There's some constituency for change, but it's delicate. And I think Bratton is trying to slowly move things in substantial ways in that direction. And is sort of openly setting up goals for himself where if he doesn't, he's going to get hit. Nationally, that constituency isn't there. And the reason there's that huge shift in numbers between white people and black people, 50 points, as to whether or not police treat people fairly. This is not on like the Black Lives Matter movement. There are lots of people who are passive, who are disinterested, who just honestly see it differently from their own experiences. But if those numbers do not shift, and I'm not saying I know the way to get them to, the idea that we're going to have fundamentally different policing is impossible. So with that, I think Azi wanted to say a bit about Bratton's self-history and how he sees himself in relation to all this, and then we'll open up conversation.
Sure. I'm not sure how many of you grew up in New York City or spent the last 20 or 30 years here, but if you remember Mayor Ed Koch, if you remember Mayor David Dinkins, if you remember that time in New York City, you sort of remember a New York City that almost doesn't exist today. It's a very different place. I grew up in Bayside, Queens. By all measures, a very good, admirable neighborhood. A lot of school teachers live there, send their kids to the public school. It's a great place to live. And growing up, I remember seeing, you know, no radio in car signs. The squeegee men at the 59th Street Bridge would greet my family when we were driving over. And that was just New York City. And there's also any number of anecdotes about growing up in New York City that you can imagine. And when Bill Bratton came to New York City, he came to a police department that literally looked different than the one today. The uniforms that the cops wore were light blue. That wasn't a very commanding or authoritative image. And he was actually in charge, when he first came to New York City, of the police that were in the subways, the subway police. and that was distinct from the New York Police Department. Those cops who were on the subways were actually considered a lower class of police officers than the NYPD. The NYPD were the real cops, and the guys who couldn't make it, you go into the subways where no one could really see you. And that's the department that Bratton inherited. And Bratton himself, coming from Boston, is an anomaly. If you read his book, his biography, he barely makes it on time to the testing facility to get into the police department in Boston. His car breaks down, he has to call his sister, he barely gets in. He makes it, and after only a few years of being in the department, Boston has layoffs. They start laying off police officers. And as anyone who's ever worked with municipal government knows, newest people in, you're the first ones out because of seniority. And Bratton just barely makes the cutoff from getting laid off. In another twist, the police department was being run not by an Irish cop in Boston, as you might expect, but by an Irish guy from outside of the city who was a progressive in the 1970s. And you can imagine that's sort of a rare find. And this person helps bring in these very forward-looking ideas about collaborating with communities. Instead of taking a nightstick to somebody's head to teach them a lesson, this guy was telling cops to communicate with people, talk to them. And it's around this time that Bratton starts learning a different way of policing that he's carried throughout his entire career. Community engagement, proactive policing, prevent crime, not just respond to it. And if you read his biography, it almost sounds like a broken record. Every department he's ever run, from a transit agency in Boston to the New York City subway police officers, to the Los Angeles police, to the NYPD, he's always wanted community engagement. The idea that cops talk to the people that they are policing to get more information. He's always wanted to make his police force, the actual men and women that show up every day, feel better about their jobs by giving them better uniforms, newer technology and equipment, so that they feel good about showing up to work. And if they inspire a little bit of jealousy and rivalry among other agencies, all the more better for it. If you have new equipment, just the way if your neighbor has a newer car in the driveway, you sort of feel this envy of wanting to match them. And if you are the object of that envy, well, that sort of makes you feel good, and you might do your job a little bit better. And he's always spoken about retraining officers, teaching them how to do their job a little bit better. And Bratton comes into a New York City that was different than when he first left. Demographic changes have occurred in New York City over the last 20 years. You have a new mayor who has said that he was going to end the stop and frisk era, which, as Harry said, was sort of a signal to people that he was going to be more amenable to anyone who felt victimized by police. And sort of in the background of what's happening, between promises to change how police behave and Bratton's idea of making it sort of more progressive but sticking to a few core principles, is a basic tenet that I think business leaders, my parents who still live in New York City, and academics and everyone else can sort of agree on in concept. That New York City is a forward-looking, progressive, great place to live as long as it's safe. If crime starts to increase, it starts to go back up to the way it was in the 1980s, all of those, or in the 60s, all of these liberties and things that we take for granted and amenities that we enjoy, all of the flexibility we give one another, start to recede because nobody wants to have their families, their lives, their property sort of put into the kind of jeopardy that we remember seeing. So as long as the bedrock of safety that people have begun to take for granted over the last 15, 20 years, as long as that is maintained, Bill de Blasio is sort of given a pass to go and focus on Vision Zero and traffic fatalities, universal pre-kindergarten classes for families that are just starting out, fighting with Andrew Cuomo to get some more money out of Albany. But as long as the crime in New York City sort of stays at this unbelievably low threshold, as long as that happens, the mayor has a free rein to go and sort of govern the city as he wishes. So that's kind of where we find ourselves with this new voice in City Hall, this return of an old warrior at the police department who sort of jockey at times to see who's the boss of who. And obviously national trends are happening, as Harry said, with Ferguson, but that's sort of where we find ourselves today.
So when Bill de Blasio is running for mayor and he says we need to stop the overuse of stop and frisk, just because of the conversation in the tabloids, television, people talking, people take that as let's end stop and frisk. And a couple of the candidates for mayor are saying exactly that, which anyone in policing is like, that's sort of nuts, because that's actually a really basic thing police officers do, is if they think something's wrong, they stop someone and try to figure out what's going on. And that's prior to seeing the commission of a crime. So there's a longer history there going back to Elliot Spitzer and the study of it that used the form cops have to fill out, a U-250, to see who cops were stopping and under what circumstances, and that exposed a lot of problems, and that these stops weren't distributed equally, even accounting for crime or where cops were sent or anything else. So it was like a lot of young black and Hispanic men who were getting stopped for things where there didn't seem to be a ton of reason for that. The city fought against that argument under the Bloomberg years really dramatically. And then right at the end, starting in 2012, they quietly started letting the air out. So the number of stops actually drops really dramatically in the last 2 years after going up very dramatically of Ray Kelly and Michael Bloomberg. And there's a sense this has to change. But for a lot of people, not Bill de Blasio, although they heard him say this and he didn't mind that during the election, it was stop policing so much. And de Blasio's argument and Bratton's argument is basically that if you have active policing, you're only getting people who are actually doing crimes, as opposed to people who fit in a group or in a neighborhood where maybe there's a lot of crime, and maybe that individual most of the time hasn't done anything wrong. So that's the distinction they're trying to establish, and I think it's taken them a little bit to get that out. But again, this all goes back to like social services and much more complicated things. And Bratton said this, that like society is sort of visiting all these issues, and the police happen to be race and inequality and how jobs are set up and where they are and aren't, and education at the tip of the government spear, so to speak. So with squeegeemen, that was a whole thing, right? But like squeegeemen individually, outside of as a symbol, and there's actually a big fight between Kelly and Bratton about who really stopped the squeegeemen. Did it happen at the end of the Dinkins years or the start of the Giuliani years? I don't really know or care. But what's interesting is there's still a handful of guys who do that. And one of them, after de Blasio came in, got arrested for like, I'm not kidding you, something like the 238th time. Guy doesn't harm people. He does a lot of squeegeeing and some sort of petty property crimes, right? And they're like, look, de Blasio's mayor and these guys are back, which was profoundly insulting. This guy's been arrested 238 times. 127 of them had happened during the Bloomberg years. This is just a guy who needs some sort of help and isn't getting that sort of help, and instead he just gets arrested and goes out and then takes like a dirty newspaper and like goes up on your windshield. What's more, this guy, I'm told, and this wasn't in the Post report, by our skeptical daily news reporters, so they have their own motives here. They're like, this guy was not someone who was really harassing people or terrifying them into giving money. He was just a guy with some newspapers and a squeegee thing and some water who would stand there all day and clean your cars and then would eventually get arrested. Like that's depressing. And not a dynamic that arresting the guy another 122 times. Okay, now he's got the message. So most of the city wasn't here before Bloomberg. Most of the people who live in New York now, Bloomberg was the only mayor they knew. Most of the cops who police New York now, Kelly was the only police commissioner they knew. So we had an unnaturally long sort of static period where all these changes happened, and now we're trying to find a new, better center. And Bratton's narrative about this, we just met with our board, and he was talking about this. He says, look, I was commissioner, And my plan was always to do the stuff I'm talking about now. And this may or may not be so, but it's what he's saying. He said many things. As Azi said, his story tends to be about his story, and he's been very consistent with some of the things he's done everywhere he's gone. It's like we wanted to get crime under control, and then the idea was that then you can stop having so much policing, you can start focusing on just the really dangerous areas and problems that are left, and having cops do other things. And he argues that when Howard Safer comes in, who's the first guy after him when he leaves after feuding with Giuliani about who should get credit for the drop in crime, that he takes this thing, Operation Impact, that Bratton had started and wanted to slowly build up, that it's going to be really well-trained cops who go after the absolute worst bad guys. And he expands it very quickly, from 100 officers to 400 officers. And within a month of that expansion and bringing in younger, less trained cops who are now not with as well-trained supervisors, you end up with the Amado Diallo shooting. And because of the politics of that, and again, because of the lack of hard numbers about how often things happen and what sort of things happen, each one gets taken as its own narrative thing. That puts an end to Operation Impact. Then Kelly comes in, now we're fast forwarding a few years, after 9/11, with this new concern for terror, with a smaller police department that keeps getting smaller. So it shrinks from a peak of 42,000 in about 97 to 34,000 now. And as that's happening, he needs to get more and more policing out of less and less cops who have these other things they also need to be doing. That needs to take some of them off their law enforcement stuff to just be dealing with terror. He comes to rely incredibly heavily on these stops as a way of doing that. And these stops, I don't know who in this room. Raise your hand. Just looking at the room. If you've been stopped.
Oh, ever?
Like 2. So 10% we'll say, right? So it's 700,000 stops. It's not 700,000 people. It's like some parts of the city where this is really, really normative and it happens all the time, and maybe it doesn't even get registered on a 250, but you're just in the lobby of your own building and someone comes in and it's like, hey, what are you doing here? Do you have your keys? And if you don't have your keys and you just went out for a minute to chat with a friend or get the newspaper or whatever, this can become uncomfortable and charged. At the same time, maybe this is a building that doesn't police itself, and you also don't want lowlives and dudes you don't know just hanging out in your lobby. And the police then are there and have to figure this out and balance it. And that balance at some point got lost, and I think it's what we're looking to restore, so that it's not the 10% of the city that is going to continually stop going through some really uncomfortable situations, whether or not they've done anything wrong, or maybe they've done something marginally wrong, or are smoking a joint, on the street, and suddenly they have a record, don't show up. I have an outstanding warrant myself right now for riding a bike on the sidewalk. I really need to deal with that. And the Brooklyn DA's office, you're a reporter, we'll fix it for you. I'm like, no thank you, I can't really do that, right? But those things will catch up to you, and they can really disrupt people's lives, and especially the younger people who are most likely to get caught up. So we can stop having that happen and still have a reasonably safe city where people in rich neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods feel reasonably comfortable going outside at night, that they're not going to have their places broken into, all that. I think it's fairly obvious that would be a better balance if we can get there.
Yeah. The expansion of Operation Impact that happened. Bill Bratton in June of 2013, when Bill Thompson was still considered the preeminent Democratic figure in the race, and Bill de Blasio was sort of this guy in the background, Bratton spoke at an event in Manhattan hosted by the Manhattan Institute, a conservative think tank which helped bring in the concept of, or help support him and Rudy Giuliani when they first came to New York City, and he has a fondness for that organization. And it was at that breakfast that Bratton, speaking very candidly as someone that many people thought would like to be police commissioner, but maybe didn't actually think he would be police commissioner, speaking very freely, he said, Operation Impact, that's how we got the whole stop and frisk problem. Because you were sending, as Harry said, you were sending more cops. You had fewer cops on the police force, and the ones you did have, you were sending them further and further outside of where they normally patrolled to these hot spots that were problems. They don't know the neighborhoods. They don't know who's the regular guy that always stands on the corner just because he's waiting for his girlfriend to get off of work, and they don't know who. They're not able to distinguish that guy from someone else who's actually just waiting to rob someone because they've never been there before. And you had cops I think Bratton had used the word literally flying across the city, stopping people left and right. And under Mayor Bloomberg, the very technocratic, numbers-based guy, he evaluated progress based on numbers. If your cops showed up and said, I stopped 150 people, there was an idea that they were doing police work and they were being active, and therefore, if crime was going down and there were 150 stops by a particular officer, well, that must be a good thing. And what Bratton has begun to argue is those numbers of police activity, the way that you record police contact with the public, it's inadequate for the kind of results you want. Ideally, you don't want someone to get robbed. You don't want someone's house to get broken into. If you solve that crime, Harry might feel better about going home at night, but the fact that he was victimized is something a cop does not take away. So ultimately, the goal is to prevent that from ever happening. And there is a very complex problem that Bratton is confronting with how do you enact de Blasio's concept of a less intrusive police force while achieving what Bratton believes as a very core goal of preventing crime before it happens. If you catch a murder suspect, there is still a dead body and a family that is mourning, even though you lock someone up for a long time. How do you prevent that from happening? And that's the overall tension that these two people are sort of dealing with. And the way that they sort of get to that point is going to be what really tells the story about this mayorality, I think.
Bratton likes to talk about predictive policing, which is figuring out patterns and saying, it looks like there's going to be more crime here. Let's send more police officers there beforehand to see what we can do. And that's very pulling premise. The great science fiction novelist Philip K. Dick used the phrase free policing, and it becomes very, science fiction often does, creepy and dystopian potentially very quickly. So he's arguing on the one hand and trying to really hold the stop at Christmas. That's the last administration. So let's
right.
agree. What those guys did, the previous guys, that was bad, and we're here to correct that. But we don't want to get rid of the good stuff they did, and the city's savior. So he's saying, let's fix that problem. But then let's figure out how we can stop stoppable crimes. And this has actually been something Bloomberg, because he was a numbers guy, and sometimes this went awry. Like measuring police activity is not the same as good policing. It would be like a doctor saying, well, I gave out so much chemo last month, it was great.
Right.
That's not necessarily in the best interest of those patients. Obviously, a better indicator would be, well, nobody has cancer, or these people's cancers are in remission. But there's a real tension between wanting to use these incredible new technologies and wanting to say what are the crimes we can predict and figure out beforehand, and those numbers are growing. Like, we have a lot less fires than we used to, because the fire department got really good at figuring out the stuff that was causing all these accidental fires and like really pushing to shift behaviors so that there were less candles inside, people smoking in bed, things like that. And you can do some of that with policing and what are basically just good and meritorious ways. But when you really start having incredibly advanced data and information about people and neighborhoods and areas, and then policing accordingly prior to crime occurring, this seems like you're going back to exactly the problem you had with stop and frisk, where you're like, well, the guns are over there. There's people who are living over there. Oh, and look, like most people who have the guns are like black males between 16 and 25. So let's go to those neighborhoods, and let's just around the city stop black males 16 to 25. Like, that's very sensible by the numbers. It leads to real like constitutional and moral problems pretty quickly. And I think when we get free from the politics of this moment, a lot of what he's pushing for is going to lead to. I can picture another commissioner saying very similar things about Bratton than like what Bratton is saying about Kelly right now, as people pick up on those numbers.
Right. One of the things that's been fascinating about watching de Blasio grapple with policing issues is that when he campaigned, the most famous phrase he had, which was uttered by himself any number of times and also by his son, Dante, with the very admirable afro, he said they were going to end the stop and frisk era. And it was a language of finality that was only being used by one other candidate in the race, John Liu, who was a very left progressive candidate. And the fear was that if people started noticing what John Liu was saying, all that progressive, left of center energy would siphon over to him, and where would de Blasio be? So de Blasio adopts this language that makes it sound as if he's going to end something permanently that is disrupting people's lives. But if you sort of dissect the phrase and what he was talking about ending an overuse of a problem, and he was also only specifying one very specific issue in the pantheon of criminal justice. And if you talk to activists, people that protest, people that organize these protests, there's any number of issues that they say are at the footsteps of the mayor currently that are not being addressed as quickly as they would like. Issues such as penalizing people for drinking on their stoops, riding their bike on the sidewalk, these low-level infractions that you sort of think aren't a big deal, but signal to the people around you that the rule of law is not being strictly enforced. These low-level quality of life crimes, that's how Bill Bratton sort of made a name for himself. You police those strictly, and the people that are breaking those rules, chances are you will find that they have broken other laws, perhaps bigger ones, and you start to find the bad guys a little bit easier. You have a reason to engage them when they are not expecting cops to engage them. And the problem is, with a safer city, you're having cops coming in contact with people like Eric Garner for generally non-violent problems, but things that police see as a battle for control and for signaling the quality of a neighborhood. So that's one of the issues that de Blasio didn't directly address while campaigning, but his rhetoric about stop and frisk acted as a signal to other people, I'm on your side. If you don't like stop and frisk, there's a chance that you don't like other issues, other problems with the police. But de Blasio's language during the campaign stopped short of a wider promise about policing problems. It was very clear where he was going on this.
There was an asterisk. I mean, he was saying that this broad thing he wanted people to hear, and then if you parse the language closely, he was saying less. So look, when Bratton comes in, very famously, he deals with turnstile jumping. He's like, this is a big issue, and there are fare beaters everywhere, and it's a sign of the chaos and disorder of the city, and it's costing us all this money. So he starts arresting people left and right for this. And 1 in 7 people has either a weapon on them, usually a knife, but sometimes a gun, or an outstanding warrant. And this was like a big proving of this whole broken windows policing theory. The guys who are doing small stuff are doing bigger stuff, and they're sending these signals, and this is compelling in a lot of ways. The problem is that if you do this for a little while, and like people start leaving their guns and knives. So since he's been back, he's continued to be very concerned with subway crimes and violations, and the subway dancers and turnstile jumpers. And every time, which has happened like 3 times, they find someone who did something, like a guy had his feet up. Police came over, and it turns out he had a gun on him. But this has happened like not 1 time in 7, but 3 times. So suddenly you're looking at like a bunch of people who are putting their feet up, who are not really doing anything else. And police have a set of tools, and you can use an admonition. Not everything has to be like a summons or an arrest, but they're limited. And like once you get someone into a situation where it's a formal and charged like police person encounter, that gets difficult. And now if it's a guy going home from work on a train without that many people on it who has his feet up, and it's like, hey, I'm writing you this $80 ticket, and that's lousy, right. And that's like your day's pay maybe. And then if you don't pay that ticket, then there's going to be a warrant out for your arrest. Like that becomes really problematic. At the same time, if people feel like paying into the subway system is totally voluntary and a choice, if it's hey, you can light up on this car, like finding exactly where the right balance is to like maintain a healthy shared system without punishing individual people in it is actually very tricky. So the Post just had one other very good story about 34th Street, I think, yeah. where basically, because you got the PATH trains and the city trains and this and that, like different cops run different parts of the station. And they're like, look, the city part is like full of these homeless people now. And they're lying there, and there's this whole corridor that's just, people sleeping there and this and that, and asking for money and so forth. And, if you go to the PA side, they're like, hey, get out of here, and they push them off. So to me, that illustrates how complicated the set of challenges this is, and what cops are doing, who again, even when it's not criminal stuff, are often at the front lines, intersect. Like, lots of people, for their own convenience, would really like cops to just push people out, because it's not like fun or super pleasant to like walk by a bunch of people who are asking for money and are lying on the floor and you can trip over them and this sort of stuff. At the same time, there are obvious questions about where these people have to go, how they feel about the shelter system, if they have mental health issues, and the answer ideally is not just cops saying, get the fuck out of here, and then possibly they end up in another station, possibly, it's just harder to go somewhere, maybe they go to another city. Like, these are actually tricky questions without easy answers, and cops, who are bureaucrats with guns, but bureaucrats, depending on the signals that are sent to them, it's like, hey, I should really engage with every single person asking for money. I should, just entirely let this go unless I see someone punching someone. Like, where exactly those signals are drawn and how you're communicating them. And again, to a very large workforce, right? That you're trying to signal things out to for, like, where that sweet spot is. With Eric Garner, this is a guy who sold Lucy's. Business owners around there didn't like that. No one in the neighborhood really minded. I think these cops might have recognized him. When they dealt with him, he was not at the place where he was generally selling Lucy's, in Staten Island, which is closer to the ferry terminal. He may or may not have just broken up a fight. And so you're in this position where they're like, you feel this sense of trying to determine who's in control. And they're like, oh, we know this guy, and there's stuff going on here, let's deal with him. And then once they get to the point where they're like, well, let's effect an arrest, right? And then he's resisting in cop jargon, right?
Yeah.
He's not wildly swinging punches. He's a very large fat man. He's not going anywhere. But he's waving his arms and saying, I'm not taking this today. And they're like, well, we have to physically bring him down. And that goes to hell. And I think most of the city, myself included, saw that one way. And then the EMTs and the officers ignoring him, was unconscious on the ground. But a lot of cops, and like good, decent cops I've talked to, who didn't love how that was handled, feel like there but for the grace of God, go on. But you get into it with the guy, you feel like you have to arrest him, there are other police there, you pass that threshold, and like the guy isn't willing to. Like, are you supposed to, like you can't be officer friendly at that point and just have a conversation. These sort of encounters happen, and then if the guy dies, which is a question, giant policy, like past cops' pay grade, past the commissioner's pay grade, really, and you have this random, really bad, horrible, fatal outcome. Like, they're nervous about that, and about how it is they're supposed to be proceeding and doing their own jobs, I think.
Yeah. Before we open up for questions, I want to ask you a question about with de Blasio and with Bratton and with the fear of all these contacts with the public for nonviolent crimes, feet on the subway, selling loose cigarettes outside of a store, which is a nuisance, but not a violent problem. I think most of us would feel pretty safe walking by someone and ignoring them if they are offering us a cigarette. But if those infractions are allowed to go by, if cops are sort of getting the signal that there's a problem with those type of encounters, or that there could be a problem, that potentially could lead to an increase in crime, either complaints about crime or more legitimate crimes somehow going forward. Do you think that there is an acceptable level of where crime can increase, but people say it's worth it if we don't have this intrusive police force in our lives? Is there a limit by which people sort of accept a slightly higher tolerance for crime and safety than what's existing now?
That's what the Bratton and de Blasio are trying to sell, that we've hit more or less a new level, and the numbers are going to go up or down 5 or 10% a year, and that's fine. And my guess is that would be fine. Look, like, fear perceptions are always, when the city was terrible, when the city is wonderful, are always worse than what's actually going on. Most days, most people are not going to be victims of a crime. 6 million people ride the trains every day. There's 6 million train rides, and I think five crimes reported a day now, so like less than 1 in a million. And people still, I've had train rides where little things start popping. It feels very charged. I think a lot of it, unfortunately, is going to depend on symbolism and whatever incidents end up becoming a lightning rod and like the handle for the broader conversation. But again, every year can't be a record low. That's not actually how anything in the world works. And if they can demonstrate over several years that we are holding a level, I think it would be perfectly fine with that. I think people would have been fine with that 4 or 5 years ago. I think their concern is that in the course of having pushed the numbers so aggressively down for so long, and having had those additional 4 years of Bloomberg and Kelly, that maybe we got below the level that's actually holdable without really, really intrusive policing. I don't think they know the answer to that yet.
I think the point you made about symbolism is incredibly interesting. One of the things that exists in New York City today that didn't really exist under Rudy Giuliani and didn't really exist in the way it does now when Bloomberg was in office was Al Sharpton. And not to overstate his role or importance, but he's a person who had gone from protesting and being in a thorn in the side of many administrations to being a ubiquitous sort of broadcast personality. He has a weeknight show on MSNBC. He's on for 3 hours each weekday on radio, and he has a Saturday rally at his office in Harlem that's broadcast nationally, and it's live streamed on his website. And it's now become a place on Martin Luther King Day. Elected officials from Chuck Schumer to Mike Bloomberg to everyone else who can fit it, who can get onto the stage, makes an appearance there. And the symbolism of police brutality is something that is not lost on him. The minute Eric Garner, that case happened, he was out there speaking about it, connecting it with a case from 20 years earlier that happened on Staten Island, which is a police chokehold case. And what's sort of amazing about that is the power to focus attention on these kind of issues, irrespective of what statistics might indicate are the problems of public safety. Thankfully, not many people are being choked by police, fatally or non-fatally. But when there is an ability to sort of look at a video about one very specific incident and connect it to a history of police brutality cases going back 20 or 30 years, it brings to focus this ongoing issue, and to have a person like him being able to sort of draw that attention, have him being able to have direct communications with the mayor, it's something that Mike Bloomberg didn't have to deal with as much in the same way, and certainly Rudy Giuliani had sort of excommunicated that guy during his time. So that's one of the other variables, I think, when you mention the symbolisms of crime that have to get managed. That's certainly one of them.
These issues. Number one, both tabloids are broadly pro-cop. I think the Post is blindly pro-cop, and the News is open, but its sympathies reflexively are with police officers. So I think you can push that way too hard. I mean, there's something called a man bites dog, right? Like, if the same thing happens again and again and again, that's dog bites man, and it's not news. When something happens that becomes a symbol that seems anomalous, or like it seems like it captures something broader, that's a man bites dog story, and that ends up on the front page. Depending on who's doing the viewing, who's a man and who's a dog here gets complicated. But of course, when there's widespread outrage, if something sparks national protests, that's going to be news. And of course, a cop doing a good job and like being officer friendly in like a great and appropriate way, leading a right and honorable life, is less likely to be news. Now, with Ferguson, the reason we have this Eric Holder report really going over the events, and it debunks not only the hands up, don't shoot part, right? But the reasons why his body was left on the ground for as long as it was. I mean, it's really serious reading. Now, this was paired, as I'm sure you know, with the second Justice report about what a horrifically screwed up place the Ferguson Police Department is, the city of Ferguson is, and their entire justice system there is. Horrific, right? So there's all this suspicion around what happened with this death, and then the national media gets involved, and that snowballs. But the only reason why we know that narrative was wrong According to Eric Holder's Justice Department, that cop did right, and the Ferguson PD generally did right with that case in the initial hours, right before the shooting itself, and then with the body there and the preliminary investigation, is because the kid who was with Brown, was telling these bogus stories to TV cameras. It sparked a national protest movement. It brought in the Justice Department, and the Justice Department did an incredibly detailed investigation to get to like a zero truth. In almost every case, barring video or barring this sort of investigation, sometimes with them, we don't know, right? So you're saying, why were all these people, like wearing these shirts, and why aren't they all saying like, I'm sorry now, I was totally wrong? They didn't know they were wrong at the time. There were these incredibly confusing and divergent accounts with just any charged event. And we had this remarkable investigation, in part because this false narrative got so much attention. And it got that attention because 82% of black people, again, do not think that the treatment they're getting by police officers is always fair. They're not saying 82% of police officers are racist. It's just broadly that treatment and how it's distributed. So plainly there were some reasons for suspicion. This not true story captured what people felt was some true thing, and they responded to it. So and the people are not taking account now. What do you mean they get a pass? Maybe you knew in your heart of heart, because you know how police officers are, or kids are, or whatever else, that this isn't what happened. And it's not what happened, and we know that now, but nobody knew that for months. And all the reporters who were there, ones with different sympathies and putting in tons of time, until this justice report came out, they didn't know fully what happened. The idea, it was so obvious to anyone. If you only wanted to know, you knew this kid was lousy, you knew this was a good shooting, simply isn't true. And our paper was with the cops on this one, like from very early on. It was like, it looks like this guy Brown reached into the car for his gun. After that, whatever happened, it's not going to get through a grand jury, right? Like the news' sympathy shifted here. But the fact is, until the justice report came out, like the stuff you're saying, like why were they lying? They had almost no one involved in that knew they were lying. They knew it captured larger things that were wrong with American policing, and this is the rarest case where we got an answer to some of these questions. So saying, how could they have not known that the whole time? I mean, it just seems
So why did the press cover them every time they wear the shirts? They were so wrong.
I think the point that Harry was making was, number one, it captured a truth that people felt to be true going back many years and many specific instances. Amadou Diallo, Eric Garner, you had Akai Gurley. There are any number of police brutality victims, and that phrase, hands up, don't shoot, originated from a story that turned out to not be true. It captured something that people felt was accurate, which was the confrontations between protesters and the Ferguson police, which became a spectacle in and of itself and a self-perpetuating farce of what policing should actually be, reinforced this idea that if you have your hands up, you actually have to tell a law enforcement official to not shoot. Now, again, most police officers, more than the majority of them, know what to do. Police in New York City actually know how to handle protests here. I've been out with some protesters where they instigate and try to provoke reactions from NYPD officers in some of the most horrific ways that you can imagine. And the NYPD, for the time that I've been there, have not responded or taken the bait. The chant of hands up, don't shoot, it captured something that the sentiment that people sort of felt, and that a videotape from Staten Island sort of confirmed for some people. Now, is it fair to go up to people and say, this report came out, do you still hold this view? You can ask that about Hakeem Jeffries, you can ask that about many members of the New York City Council. At the time, it seemed to be resonant, but if you want to go up and challenge people to say, do you reevaluate this view, that's fair. But I think the reason why Holder's Justice Department released those two reports at the same time was because they got to the truth about one thing, but it made more sense when they had the broader context of what Ferguson police were doing. One of the anecdotes that was widely pulled out from the second report was that a gentleman, a black man who was sitting in his car after a basketball game, was charged with, among one of the charges he was hit with, was lying about his identity when he gave his name as Mike as opposed to Michael. I mean, this is one of the absurdities that is hard to encapsulate when it's only seen as an isolated incident. But when it's an entire city that feels besieged by police, phrases like hands up, don't shoot may have started with someone telling a story out of turn, but it resonated with people who have had their own experiences.
Not besieged by police over criminal things.
Right.
Besieged by police over tickets that were a revenue source that people were continually going to jail with. I mean, it just, ugh.
Protest movements are never as unified or as cohesive as they look like from the outside. If you're sitting at home in Bayside and you see on the news that there was a protest down Fifth Avenue, you sort of get the idea that everyone was on the same page and everyone agreed and everyone stepped forward with the left foot and then the right foot. Oftentimes, it's much more complicated. If any of you got the chance to see the Broadway play All the Way about LBJ with Bryan Cranston, the actor from Breaking Bad, it was a wonderful explanation and a very vivid one about how people that have the same objective go about it in different ways. Martin Luther King was working and trying to cut deals with the White House while younger activists were saying, we're going to go and do freedom rides down south and be much more confrontational and engaged. The current protests, and there's actually one in about 2 weeks, now that the weather's a little bit nicer, there's actual some friction among these groups, namely between Al Sharpton and groups that are allied with him that have a direct communication with City Hall, and younger activists that don't need a figurehead, a spokesman, or even a speech maker to sort of make their point. In fact, one of the stories I wrote was about how Al Sharpton used some very charged language to disparage younger protesters, specifically in Ferguson, who at one of his rallies demanded time to speak on stage to acknowledge that they were present and that they were the real activists here. So there's a tension between speech makers that get into a room with a de Blasio and the younger people who can organize a rally on Twitter and Facebook that don't need his type of gatekeeper. And there's questions about how far do you go. There are some people who literally say, we don't need any police. And those are really people on the fringe, I think, by all accounts. Then you have others who say, well, we need better training. That's like some people, de Blasio and Bratton argue that training will get you to better policing. You have Al Sharpton's who are saying you need criminal prosecutions. Nothing other than these people going to jail is going to serve these ends. And then you have others who have this laundry list. You need an independent prosecutor to sort of charge these crimes. Well, why do we elect local prosecutors if we need an independent one for police matters? So there's this very lively conversation, but they don't always happen in easy to find locations like on Face the Nation or Meet the Press or on New York One. So it's a little bit harder to find where these pockets are, but it's not as unified. And Al Sharpton, by his own accord, is himself sort of an outside agitator. He thought that black elected officials and Hispanic elected officials in the 1980s and 90s didn't do enough to integrate New York City. There was a time where you couldn't walk into Howard Beach or Canarsie or some other neighborhoods because it was not hospitable enough. And we had some very tragic instances where that turned out to be true. And he very proudly notes that he's the one who led marches through those neighborhoods to sort of confront that, whereas people like Mayor Dinkins and other elected officials like Charlie Rangel didn't do enough to confront, and that they were operating within a system that didn't really bring about that kind of change the way he did. So that tension is replaying itself with Sharpton in a different role and younger activists sort of doing what younger activists do.
Anytime you get what do they want, who's they? Who's we? And at the Meet the Press level, it's very obvious, and as these things are happening, it's really complicated. Plus, you have some people who absolutely want everything on their issue, and other people who say they want everything because that's a very good negotiating position. De Blasio, in his own ways, has tended to come in, like when he's negotiated with Albany, for instance, which is not a different world, but he's come in with maximalist demands, and then done a good job of getting as much as he can within the protest groups here. So the Justice League, which is a very interesting group and is a lot of the savvier young activists, but is also an offshoot, going back to much older civil rights stuff, of Harry Belafonte operation. Has played this really interesting medium role where they're both putting pressure on Sharpton, and Sharpton is supposed to be putting more focused pressure on City Hall but Sharkin as one person, Tamika Mallory, who's like his nexus with the Justice League to keep them from getting too wild and too far off from where he wants them to be. But he doesn't quite, it's not clear who has what tiger about what tail, as everyone is trying to deal with this. In the meantime, when the Justice League won, after several of these large and disruptive marches, and disruptive in part because de Blasio and Bratton gave them space to be disruptive, to allow for this much symbolism and this much protest, right? And it was a pretty big march. Like people haven't just been allowed to march over bridges before. And here this is happening. So this group Cop Watch, which is just anti-police, in like a very straight up sense, is like, stop snitching. And then there were these black bloc anarchists who were marching under the banners of these big marches, and they were the ones who were like throwing garbage cans at cops and doing all sorts of really disruptive stuff, and allowing people who are suspicious of this to be like, you see how they are. But this is a very different they, right? But if you're having an open movement and anyone who's marching is a member, if people want to march and do disruptive stuff, how do you own that? So de Blasio wanted Justice League to promise that they would police their own marches. And they more or less said that, but then Cop Watch said, stop snitching. And then Justice League, after meeting with de Blasio, and his only takeout from them was they're going to police their own marches, they're like, yeah, but we're not turning anyone into the NYPD because that's not how we develop trust. So you get how these big social changes that are these broad currents that people really want get rapidly caught in these much smaller questions and of personalities and cohesion and like what things you want to go to the absolute mat for, even if they maybe discourage other people from participating. And like the extent you're at the mercy of like crazies and infiltrators and outside groups, if you want to demonstrate like the largeness and openness and widespread support of your movement, like these struggles are they're not new, and it's actually very informative to look at what's happening. Now to know something about how these sorts of things played out in the 1960s and earlier in less successful sort of civil rights pushes.
And specifically with the incident of throwing garbage cans, there was a CUNY professor who was accused of throwing a garbage can during a melee with police officers during one protest. And that was an offshoot of a more organized protest. But at that specific location were lawyers who wore, I believe, distinctive green-colored hats.
National Legal Guild.
National Lawyers Guild, I think.
Yeah.
And their job is to be like professional witnesses. They go to an event and they stand by and they observe in case there's a confrontation with police, if cops say somebody did something. There's a trained lawyer who is there that can say, I observed this, and here's what happened. Well, when the garbage can got thrown, when a couple of officers got punched in the face, there was video, there were photographs, and at some point, Bratton presented all this material, and he said, here are the people we're looking for, these are their faces, and by the way, I'm a little bit disappointed, more than a little bit perhaps, that there were some lawyers there who didn't interfere and try to help these officers that were clearly in trouble. And I contacted the lawyer for the CUNY professor who was arrested and accused of being one of the people that threw the garbage can. And the lawyer's name is escaping me, but I said, Bratton said there were some lawyers there and you guys didn't help out the cops. Lawyer's quote, damn right. Taking the very hardline view that they are there strictly to observe and not to interfere. So you have a very complicated scenario of where nobody wants to be seen assaulting officers. Now you have questions about how far do you go to interfere with this? What is the role of Cop Watch? What is the role of the New York City Justice League? Do you turn other people in these questionable moments? It's a much more complicated issue, and I don't know if these are if those specific dynamics were happening down during the civil rights marches, and I think also during those times it was a lot more clear who was right and who was wrong.
Plainly not to everyone at the time, but
right. Yes.
A lot of what's going on now with protests are attempts to trigger dramatic and picturesque responses from police.
Yes.
If you go back to a lot of what we were dealing with in the 60s, there was no need for triggers there. What was new was having cameras and broadcast and suddenly a national and international audience interested in these issues in ways that shifted policy and practices to some extent. So I saw it during Occupy. I see to some extent during some of the Black Lives Matter stuff, like attempts to. What's interesting actually is Occupy was much more sort of eager to like get a cop up on a horse on its rear legs and then like stomping someone down, and then like you see. Like I just saw a lot of people there with daddy issues who were like really hoping to get beaten by the NYPD. I'm not trying to be too kind to the NYPD here. I got roughed up twice as a reporter at these by cops for no good reason. While in other circumstances, also seeing cops while people were really trying to get them going, like very aggressive and in their faces and waving hands and like literally spitting on people, you know, who and punching them, you know, and like cops not responding. It was impressive. Wasn't always the case, but one of the complications is you're trying to draw attention. Naturally, anyone who's trying to affect change, you want to create really like striking backdrops to it that illustrate the problems you're dealing with. And there's something weird in New York in particular. Like you've got this dynamic where you have cop protesters protesting a protest that are policed by cops, and like how everyone responds to and plays out that set of roles. And if the NYPD needs some fundamental reforms, but most of the cops on it, which I think is fair to say, are not like just power hungry or reflexively brutal monsters. It's a reasonably well trained force in a lot of ways, and the real limits there. I mean, you're still talking about often like 25-year-olds with like guns and a badge and a uniform. And they're not always going to behave perfectly, and sometimes they're going to behave really wrongly, but you're trying to symbolize these broader problems, and to me, always going back to like individual anecdotes or cases, even when somebody has done absolutely nothing wrong, like say Tamir Rice in Cleveland or Akai Gurley here, is a dangerous tactic because it gets you away from. It's not about any individual officer. I don't think if our force is much more diverse, and these upper ranks still aren't. But I don't think if the force was to be demographically representative of the city, the problems would be all that much better or worse just because of that. And in fact, I think it would be a damper on change in some ways, because part of the reason nobody covered Rikers for many years when it was a terrible, like monstrous, nightmarish place under Bloomberg, is it's a harder narrative to write because the officers union is like one of the strongest and most important components of like the black civil service in New York, in the way cops once were for the Irish. And so you don't have a racial narrative to it. It gets more complicated immediately. Even if somebody in jail has done nothing wrong or really didn't deserve to be there, like getting to that zero is harder.
The monitoring that you're talking about, the intervention, it was from a lawsuit about how police conduct stop and frisk. And again, that's one very particular way of police contacting a suspect. If they see somebody running down the street with a gun and a bank alarm going off, they just attack the guy. But if there's a question about someone's conduct, they might approach the person, ask them questions. If they think there's a reason to, they'll frisk the person and they write out a form. There was a lawsuit filed that said, in short, the number of black and Hispanic people being stopped and frisked is out of proportion with New York City's population and out of proportion with the people identified as suspects in crimes. And a judge, a federal judge here said, cops, you've done it, you violated people's constitutional rights, and the remedy is to have a court-appointed monitor watch how you do this program. And the second remedy is cops wearing body cameras in one precinct in every borough that had the highest number of stop and frisks. So the court literally wants to see what is the encounter that cops are having with the public that created this high number of stop and frisks. So the monitor is in place and is hiring a staff and is a little bit slow at doing that. The body cameras, again, fits in with what Bill Bratton likes. He likes technology. He loves technology. If you want to get Bratton talking for 1 hour, just say the word technology, and you'll see your appointments just get blown to hell. He really likes to talk about this. Now, there's a very interesting question about what happens here. If the public sees what the cop sees in these encounters, is the public going to side with the officers? Yeah, and the judge came to that conclusion based on the number of stops, and also, I hate to say it, because the forms that the officers were being told to fill out, they said, it would say, what was the reason for the stop? And one of the reasons you could give was something called furtive movement, meaning furtive movement, somebody moving suspiciously. And if you're a cop, if you just sort of hate the idea of paperwork, you put your name, the date, here's the easiest box to check, and you're sort of done. So that's where a lot of this came from. And the cameras are meant to give a more detailed explanation about what's going on.
But that's always been the case. The police want to block certain sorts of protests. That they're trying to infiltrate.
It's wrong legally.
It is. It's wrong.
That's what I'm saying, that they know what to do.
They didn't do it. They did not want the occupied people to live in a park and to be there for months, to have television cameras there, to divert much of the police department. There are always issues with that, and police, like everyone else, are going to try to defend their own purview and turf. And they have, and I'm sure will continue to cross lines doing that. And we'll generally find out at like 2, 5, or 10-year lags as court cases come out. But I don't think this has sort of stopped the right to protest or the effectiveness of well-thought-out, serious protests. 2
points I would make to that. Number one, there was another lawsuit about 40 years ago that is still working its way through the courts called the Handshoe Agreement, about how the New York City Police Department is allowed to monitor and observe and interact with political organizations as they protest. It relates to surveillance, monitoring, free speech. How do you do this? It's a very long-running lawsuit, but it directly deals with this idea. And the second point I'll make is when you have protest movements, when you have people in a room, when you have 2 New Yorkers in a room, somebody says one thing that I don't like, you will hear within 3 seconds somebody say, "You're a traitor, you're a plant, you're a cop." I will tell you, I was out with the protesters before Christmas. They're going down Madison Avenue, and there's no particular leader. There's whoever has the bullhorn is the leader for the minute, and they're deciding whether or not to go forward, to make a left turn. Somebody says make a left turn, but go on the sidewalk. Somebody says make a right turn, but go on the street. One of them accused the other one of being a cop, and you have that just based on. So that's one of the things that happens at protests all the time.
Look, what media does is we telescope. We're like, there's this broad thing, and here is a person or instance that symbolizes it, and these things must seamlessly connect. They don't seamlessly connect, which is how you end up with these complicated false narratives. But to the extent that people are focusing on structural or systemic issues, or filling in the many holes in like the baseline knowledge we should have about police departments and what they're actually doing, how it compares from place to place and over time, all that. As opposed to keying in on individual cases, and there's been a long drumroll of those, I think it's helpful. But like, very serious, dedicated people disagree with me strenuously on this. It's a complicated question. And look, the more reductions you get, just think about headlines, right? They're like very tight spaces. So part of the reason Obamacare won as a phrase and was not initially beneficial to Obamacare was it was shorter. So the auto bailout was the $700 billion $700B bailout, because it fit in that space. And there was like a competing phrase, I don't remember what it was for the bailout now, that was more accurate, but twice as long.
Right.
And like nobody used it. So anti-cop, 8 characters, pro-cop, 7 characters. And at a certain level, if people have feelings about policing, it's hard to avoid that sort of reductiveness to the extent that serious people who are engaged can do so. And to sort of press when they're discussing with other people or putting things out there to avoid that and to stress that case, I think it's helpful.
Yeah, and just also, you sort of separate the more responsible actors from the less responsible ones by asking them very specific questions, like, what is your solution? And if your solution is, let a guy piss in the hallway, let someone smoke a joint on your steps, let somebody hold up a liquor store, like when you start hearing answers like that, then you realize that some people are calling for really no policing, and then it's up to the reporter and the editor to sort of figure out where in a story, if at all, that person goes.
What's tricky about that, right, is you have a reasonable set of beliefs, and then there's somebody else who shares many of those with you, shows up at protests, and has a further set of beliefs, and are you supposed to be policing that person, and you're out now?
Right.
And I can't share that with you. I mean, these are the questions that every protest movement, and really every political movement has to deal with, like how wide your tent can be in, like what bad or uncomfortable behaviors, that means you're allowing in it and willing to accept those associations. And people outside of it are always going to be like, well, what about that thing? What about that person? What about this that seems off? And aren't you going to do something about it? Or are you just a hypocrite? Or you are anti-cop? And that's, I mean, that's endlessly complicated to the extent that like sane people can make reasonable distinctions in their own words, and with those they're most closely associating with it, it's helpful.
One of the things that's unfortunate about stories like this is that, unfortunately, there are a number of instances where people are shot and killed by police. Sometimes it's justified, like in City Hall about 10 years ago when there was a person who shot and killed a councilman. James Davis. The person who shot James Davis was also shot and killed by the police. Not many people argue that that was unjustified. I think the one that there were a number of people who were shot and killed by police near and around the time of the Mike Brown incident. One was Tamir Rice, like a 12-year-old who was, I think, had a toy gun of some kind. And then there was another person near Ferguson, I believe, who was shot and killed. That might have also been, I think, captured on cell phone video.
St. Louis, yeah.
So, but
Dorian Johnson was the friend who was with him and gave the initial account saying he was trying to surrender, his hands were up. He is still alive, which I knew was true as of 2 days ago, but I checked to make sure I wasn't behind.
Yeah. So, but getting the information about these instances, getting it fast and getting accurate, that's one of the challenges. The New York City of the 1950s, your experience of it, that it might have been wonderful if you were growing up in the projects. There are some people that would take strong exception to that statement. People that didn't even have the opportunity to move into those projects. People that were discriminated against and possibly lived in more violent-prone parts of the city would probably disagree that the good old days were so good. I do acknowledge that there was something that was working in society where you could be poor, you could be less educated, and somehow find your way to a more safe and stable life. There was an upward mobility that was sort of more generally accepted, that those same steps seem to be further away from more people. If you were a high school graduate, I think in the 1950s, you could probably find a job, keep yourself out of trouble, and live a good life. Nowadays,
you can't even do it at college.
Except if you went to St. John's. Right, and St. Francis. Social programs have changed. Social expectations have changed. The demographics of New York City have changed. We're getting people. My father came to New York City from Iran after a war. His experience growing up was very different than some of the people around him. I don't think it can just easily be dismissed as other people came here, social programs broke down, the city went to hell, and now people are just behaving badly. There is something to the effect of people hearing stories about a mayor saying, I'm going to end stop and frisk, and believing they have the right to resist arrest, which is not allowed. There is this idea that expectations, either in school or perpetuated by mass media, is not as nuanced, because of headlines being shorter and whatnot, is not as nuanced as it should be. You can argue that, I remember Eva Moskowitz, when she was a city council member, complained that civics is not taught. People literally do not know what a city council is, what a mayor is, what a borough looks like, what their own borough looks like. There are any number of things that have sort of broken down in the civic education. How many people even go to a community board meeting? How many people even know about that? So there's a lot of social fabric that has broken down. People go to work, come home, they don't necessarily know who their neighbor is. There's not as many communal places for people to gather unless they've already agreed upon many preconceived notions. If you're going to church with people, you sort of have a belief system that you all agree with. But if you don't belong to an organized church, if you're sort of working at further and further away, longer and longer hours, you don't have those same type of social places to meet and greet and gather with other people to come to a consensus in your neighborhood. There's a lot of things that have changed. Different voices in media, different expectations, different things being taught in school. But or not being taught in school. But I don't think it's necessarily the 1950s was so great and therefore everything else is bad. There are people who have lived in the Ravenswood and Queensbridge houses who might have had a tough time when they were younger, but have grown up and moved on, and those stories often don't get told. And just like you said about good cops, where are their stories? There's a lot of people who grew up poor in New York City, not as many as I would like, but there are people who grew up with tough circumstances whose stories don't get told, and it's same as cops. But I don't know if looking back at yesterday with these like rose-tinted glasses is as accurate for as many people.
Well, actually, you had a different situation. You had neighborhood cops.
We're going to have to leave it there. We won't get into our neighborhood cops. We're very good for people who are in neighborhoods, when many neighborhoods were more distinct in terms of the ethnic and social identities who lived there, and we're very good if you were in the we. You were talking about the they and how services are now, but very not good if you were not part of the we. And that wasn't always simple, it wasn't always just racial,
I disagree with
but that was a
you
problem.
so much.
And
Because the cops knew their people.
Bratton is talking about a big return to community policing now, so we
And
may be
need
going
it.
full
And I
circle.
come